Hello and welcome to Mr. C's History Walks. Today we're going to have a little walk around London on the theme of US presidents. There are some statues, some memorials to US presidents, but also some US presidents have been here to London, and there's one who's been just outside London as well, where they've had some interesting activities and fun times. We're going to have a little look at what connections we can still see. I'm here in Grosvenor Square. Behind me is the old US Embassy. Of course, it's been moved now to Vauxhall. But if you come to the square, there's lots of different American connections. And let's just start here. Well, let's start here in Grosvenor Square with the statue behind us of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was president from he won the 1932 election, and then he died in 1945. He actually won 4 elections, served 4 terms, something that cannot be done since the 22nd Amendment has been passed after him, limiting US presidents to 2 terms. So he will never be beaten. He is the longest serving US president. What did he do? Why is he merits a statue here in London? Well, of course, he was the US president during the Second World War. America emerged triumphant, after the invasion or the attack on Pearl Harbor by the Japanese. December 7th, 1941, a date that will live in infamy, as Roosevelt said, and he brought in America on the Allied side. There was no suggestion perhaps that they were going to join the German side, but there was a suggestion that they might sit out the war. It's just involving Europe. So he came on the side of the British, significant. But internally in America, he's synonymous with a New Deal. When he took power in 1932, the Republicans under Hoover and Coolidge of the laissez-faire, rugged individualism had dragged the country to the ground. The Wall Street crash, Hoovervilles, poverty, etc. Roosevelt came in on a promise of a New Deal, jobs, economy booming, industry, etc., etc., and that was propelled even more in the Second World War when they were building tanks and aircraft carriers and all sorts of things as well. So a great wartime president, a great domestic president. He is here in London looking down on us, and it is actually not his only statue here. There is another one. Well, the other statue of Roosevelt is here. I'm actually too big for this bit, so we'll only be here a little briefly. But this sculpture is known as Allies. I've got President Roosevelt here on my right, Prime Minister Winston Churchill here on my left. This was built in 1995, 50 years after peace to celebrate it. I'm too small, so let's go over there and we can talk about this a bit better. That's better now. Right, let's talk about these two. So we've already seen Roosevelt in Grosvenor Square, but let's say this is a statue specifically to their friendship. Now, I think it was more of a friendship of convenience. We like to think they were great buddies and had wonderful chats with each other, but I'm not so sure. They're very, very different men. Churchill, imperialist, conservative, old-fashioned, firmly believe in the British Empire. Roosevelt was a New Deal, almost progressive Democrat, with what for welfare reforms, etc., etc. Very different politically people. Yes, they're trying to win a war together, but Roosevelt was reluctant to join the war for a long, long time, and Churchill did try his best to get him involved and get him in, but Roosevelt kept saying no. It wasn't until, of course, the Japanese invaded America. There was also a bit of mistrust at the conferences, the Tehran and the Yalta conference. Churchill definitely mistrusted Stalin. Roosevelt was trying to be a go-between between the two, and I don't know if Roosevelt ultimately trusted, but I think the big issue was actually India. Churchill was adamant that India was not going to leave the British Empire, whereas Roosevelt was extremely keen. Indeed, Roosevelt had made deals with Nehru and Jinnah and Gandhi, etc., Chandra Bose even, for that, to try and break the British Empire. So I'm not so sure. Maybe I shouldn't be. Well, rather annoyingly at Grosvenor Square, the old American embassy is under building works. They've sold it to the Qataris. I don't know if the Qataris are building their embassy or just general flats or something. But annoyingly, there were 2 statues to US presidents here. One looking at us here was Dwight D. Eisenhower, and over the other side, crucially, was Ronald Reagan. So I can't talk to you about his Reaganomics and the trickle-down theory, and we can't talk about his impact on hip-hop music and how the African-American community was so upset with him that they channeled it through music, and we can't talk about his winning the Cold War, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall, or his relationships with the Queen and Margaret Thatcher. We just can't talk about it, but I suppose I just have. But anyway, Eisenhower was here as well, but we can talk about Eisenhower here, just looking over to the old American embassy, because in this building, it's been replaced since then, but in this building he was located, along with in Kingston, I believe, with two men on houses. He came over to plan essentially D-Day. He was Supreme Commander-in-Chief of the Allied forces in World War II, the big head honcho in order to try and win World War II over the Germans. So he was quite formidable before he became US president, because he was one of the very few first presidents, or very few in the list of them, who had no real political background before. Most presidents had either been vice president, or they'd been a governor of the state, or they'd been in the Senate or thing. Eisenhower had been none of that, but his credentials are pretty good to have essentially commanded a victorious, massive force that wins a global war. So I think that kind of puts it there. Now, old Ike, how did he rule? Well, he was a good old-fashioned Eisenhower Republican, didn't do much like some of the people of the 1920s. He did preside over something called the military-industrial complex, where America industrialized greatly militarily, and of course the arms race of the Soviet Union was at this time, and unbelievable creation of nuclear weapons. So that was part of his time. There were some liberal reforms he did through the Civil Rights Act, etc., but and Little Rock didn't quite move on. So he steadied the ship, I would say, after the Second World War, and then we went on to the 1960s with Kennedy. Well, the final place to talk about in Grosvenor Square is behind me, number 9 Grosvenor Square, which in the 1780s was the home to John Adams and his wife Abigail. John Adams was a founding father. He had played a major part in the American Revolution, and in the Declaration of Independence, 1776. George Washington doesn't become president until 1789. There was a sort of interregnum period where essentially they were writing the U.S. Constitution, of which John Adams played a key part in, because he was a trained lawyer and he firmly believed in the rights of the individual under the law. So that's why the Constitution's got lots of interesting, like the Fifth Amendment, etc., etc., lots of interesting legal requirements. Perhaps John Adams played a key part in it. But why is it here in London? Because he was the ambassador to this newly formed, declared United States to Britain. He was negotiating a lot with a former power, the country they had just shifted off. With that, then, he returns back in 1789 and he becomes the first Vice President of the United States of America. So Britain has the statue for George Washington of the first president we've seen. Here is the home of the first Vice President. But that doesn't stop there. He serves George Washington as Vice President for 8 years, and then he himself becomes President 1797 after that, after Washington. Interestingly, he's the only president to essentially not be part of the Republicans really, or you would call the Democrats. He was a Federalist, the Federalist Party. And eventually, his downfall came from that. Many people weren't happy with the Federalists because, as a president, he introduced something called the Alien and Sedition Act, which made it harder for people to become citizens, and that was considered quite deeply unpopular here. But a really interesting person. Now, he, of course, had a son. He had several children, but one of his sons was called John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams became president as well. So John Adams became the first president who had a son who was president. We've only had George Bush Sr. who's done that as well. So the Adams dynasty lives on here in Grosvenor Square. This is Stratford Place, just off Oxford Street, and behind me here is a rather interesting blue plaque. It's a blue plaque to the 8th President of the United States, Martin Van Buren. Now, he had been ambassador to Britain from America before he became president, and he became president in 1836, and he was only a one-term president until 1840. He's not really considered much for success. He presided over an economic collapse and didn't really get on with anyone, and indeed lost the 1840 election. But there is an interesting fact about Martin Van Buren. He went on to become an anti-slavery campaigner, all very good, but he is sometimes considered the forerunner or the main instigator for the word okay. What is the story here? Well, okay actually comes from all correct, but sort of done in that Scandinavian American style, came by and abbreviated to okay. And now he popularized it because his nickname was also okay, Martin Van Buren. He came from a town in New York State called Kinderhook, and his nickname was Old Kinderhook. So when it came to the 1840 election, his campaign poster simply said, "It's okay to vote okay," and therefore a legend was born and a term was used all the way. So what an interesting person. That post-presidency, perhaps we now know him more as the man who popularized the word okay. I am here by the National Gallery, just in Trafalgar Square, and behind me, of course, is a statue of George Washington, the first President of the United States of America. It's a rather nice statue with him holding his muskets and slightly warlike. Significantly, this was donated by the people of Virginia, not the people of the United States of America, as it says it was donated by the Commonwealth of Virginia. And there's another really great rumor about this statue, is that George Washington vehemently stated he would never set foot on British soil. And so the rumor is that several people brought a bit of Virginia or bit of America to the land underneath, and that he is indeed, his statue is standing on American soil rather than British soil. There's no way of verifying that, so I'm not ultimately sure that's the case. Who was George Washington? Well, as I said, the first US president, but he was essentially leading the nation way before the first presidential and the first US Constitutional Congress declared him so in 1789. He was there during the battle for the American Revolutionary War, the Declaration of Independence, 1770s. And in the 1770s, sorry. But he was commanding the army. He was commander-in-chief. He is the one who fought the British off, and he has now got the title of Chief General of all the armies in America. He's been posthumously given that in the 1970s. What did he do as president? Well, he did various things. The idea of republicanism, he didn't set up the Republican Party, but this idea of there's no need for a monarch, religious tolerance, and he also really set the precedent of a two-term presidency, just in power for 8 years. He could have gone on for longer, but he didn't. He gave up power. Not only did he oversee a peaceful transition to platform power, he voluntarily gave it up, which in the 1790s, around the time of French revolutions, the beginnings of Napoleon, etc., was an extraordinarily radical idea to give up your power. So well done, George, there. The obviously negative side of George, he was a slave owner. Indeed, did not treat his slaves terribly well. So perhaps he is, in the context of the time there, he's not a US president renowned for his positive and equal views on slavery. But anyway, there we go. There's young George, or old George as he probably was by the time he stood for this statue. Here he is in Trafalgar Square. This is perhaps a good place to end part one of the US presidents in London and England video. Tune in next week to get more.